Welcome, everyone. I know there'll be some people streaming in, but I think we're nearly complete and want to start off this last part of the whole meeting, last part of the day, last part of the meeting. Stay tuned. We're going to have some prizes coming up, but first, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Sharon Glotzer, today's closing plenary speaker, former colleague of mine from the University of Michigan. Actually, we were remembering Monday night over drinks, and she actually reminded me just how embarrassingly short a period we did overlap there. I think it was literally days, well, we met briefly, but I took off days after she officially started. Just a coincidence, of course, because I'm a big fan of her work. She's made a number of key advances in soft matter science. I'll just mention two. Rather recently, she's really done beautiful pioneering work on so-called patchy particles, colloids. If that's unfamiliar to you, it's emerging as sort of a field of its own. It's a beautiful way of controlling interactions and self-assembly of colloids. And in addition to that, though, she also did some very fundamental work in glass formation. And I want to emphasize that word fundamental because I would like to point out that her official affiliation is actually in an engineering department at Michigan, chemical engineering and material science, both actually. Sharon is a great example of something near and dear to my heart, also a topic of current discussion within FOM, namely bridges between fundamental science, say physics, and engineering. And Sharon's a living example of that kind of a bridge. Her background, of course, is maybe not too surprisingly coming from a physics background in both undergrad and graduate, UCLA and Boston University respectively. And then she started her independent career at NIST, National Institutes of Standard and Technology, and after a few years there, then joined engineering at Michigan. She also has appointments in physics and applied physics. But I think she represents a very nice mix of the fundamental and the applied, and not only taking fundamental insights and finding or seeking applications, but the other way around, which I think is equally important to emphasize. Very good fundamental problems can arise from practical considerations, and I think we're going to be hearing today about entropy and what is more fundamental, for instance, than the second law of thermodynamics, and you'll know that that also has its origins in very practical problems. So Sharon has a number of honors. I won't go through the list, but just point out that she's been very recently elected to the National Academy of Sciences, also a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences, and very recently won the MRS Prize of the Materials Research Society, and that was just this last fall, I believe. So, without further ado, please, Sharon, we're happy to have you give the closing lecture.
Thank you, very nice. Good afternoon, everyone. I am really just thrilled and honored to be here, to be able to attend the meeting this week and to be able to give this closing lecture. I've listened to a number of really wonderful talks and learned quite a bit. As Fred said, I'm going to talk about entropy. There's nothing more fundamental than that. Behind me, you see a molecular dynamics or Monte Carlo computer simulation of a suspension of nanoparticles in solution that when the colors are blue indicates that the system is in a fluid state. Then you'll start to see yellow regions emerging. The yellow is, we color the particles yellow when the particles start to organize locally and start to nucleate a crystal that grows and takes over the whole system. And this is playing on a loop, so you can watch it a few times. And this simulation is meant to model a typical situation of nanoparticles that the majority of nanoparticles today that are grown in solution from metals, metal ions like silver, will grow in a faceted way to form little polyhedral crystals. And here we have little octahedrally shaped crystals. And under normal circumstances, this might be a very nice simulation, but it wouldn't be so fascinating, except for the fact that there are no forces, no intrinsic forces between the particles in this simulation whatsoever. The only thing that there is in this system is excluded volume. The particles are hard particles. They're moving around by Brownian motion, rotating, translating around as though they're in suspension, and they simply cannot overlap one another. And yet, they are going from a disordered fluid state spontaneously to a crystal state. And this is happening solely due to entropy. So we're going to talk about entropy. I know it's the last talk of the day, so I don't want to get too heavy with equations, but I want to start out with a few relationships that I know will be familiar to you. When we think about entropy, we think about the Gibbs entropy, and the way that Gibbs formulated it was that the entropy can be thought of as the product of the probability of a given microstate or instantiation of a system. An example of a microstate in the previous example might be one snapshot of this collection of nanoparticles at one instant of time. That's one possible arrangement of the particles, one possible thermodynamically allowed microstate of the system. So the product of the microstate, of the probability of that microstate, here p sub I, times the logarithm of that probability, summed over all of the microstates in the system. And generally speaking, in any system, the probability depends on the energy of that microstate, and so it depends on the temperature of the system. Now, if you think in terms of quantum field theory, quantum mechanical applications, then we think in terms of the von Neumann entropy, where we think in terms of a density matrix, where you can write the entropy as the trace of this density matrix times the logarithm of the density matrix. And when this density matrix can be written in terms of its eigenvectors, then we can write the entropy in a form that's very similar to the form in which Boltzmann wrote the form of the entropy. And so we understand what entropy means in that case. When entropy is zero, you have a pure state, and then the measure of the entropy away from zero is a measure of the departure of your quantum system from a pure state. And when we go to now information theory, then we have Shannon's expression for entropy, and the way to think about the entropy in this context is that entropy is basically the equivalent to the minimum number of binary or yes/no questions that you have to ask to fully determine a system. So you guys are familiar with the game of 20 questions. You know this game where I say, I'm thinking of a famous person. You have 20 questions. They have to be only yes or no questions to guess who I'm thinking of. But now let's imagine that we're playing a bazillion question instead of 20 questions. And I say, I'm thinking of a famous person. Well, Fred here, with his finely honed inquisitive skills, might start asking, to try to figure out who I'm thinking of. He might say, is it Gandhi? Is it Barack Obama? Is it Lady Gaga? Is it Einstein? And he could keep going, and eventually he might guess who I'm thinking of. And in particular, if he doesn't know anything about me, and so all choices of famous people are equally likely, on average, it would take him a very long time to guess the right person. But someone else, one of the more advanced students in the audience, for example, for whom statistical mechanics and thermodynamics is very fresh in their minds, might say, alive or dead, male or female, right? Under 40, well, you wouldn't ask it that way because you have to be yes or no. So you'd have to ask male, you know. So really quickly, you would design your questions to eliminate huge numbers of possibilities or huge parts of phase space so that you could hone in on the correct answer as quickly as possible. And if you could optimize the number of questions to minimize the number of questions that you have to ask to get to the answer, that's how to think about what entropy means. Now, if we think about a closed thermodynamic system, then all microstates are equally likely. In general, in any system, all microstates with the same energy are equally likely. But if we have a closed system, they all have the same energy, and all microstates are equally likely. And so if we have omega microstates, then the probability of any one is just 1 over the total number of microstates, and then very quickly, the Gibbs expression for the entropy reduces to the Boltzmann entropy, the famous expression that we know, K with a constant in front, K Boltzmann, for purposes of units, times the log of the number of microstates in the system. Okay, so why is that important? That is a situation that we are thinking of when we look at that simulation from the beginning, where hard particles spontaneously organized under no intrinsic interparticle forces, but solely due to entropy in the system. And so the key point that I want you to take away from the lecture today is that entropy can order stuff if there are more ways for the system to be ordered than there are for it to be disordered. That's counterintuitive to many people. Oftentimes, we think of entropy as being synonymous with disorder, and oftentimes that is the case. And strictly speaking, you can think of it as disorder in the microstates and the phase space, but in terms of thinking in spatial arrangements and thinking about the order as we conceive of it in a typical way, entropy isn't usually thought to order stuff, but indeed it can. And Onsager knew this. In 1949, he showed us that if you have a system of hard rods and you crowd them enough, and you have hard rods that are solely excluded volume interactions, they can't overlap, nothing else. And if the aspect ratio of the rods is long enough, then at some volume fraction, those rods will go from a completely disordered fluid state where they're pointed in any direction to an aligned state where on average the rods are aligned with one another. And here we show the aligned or ordered state by green and the disordered state by red. And it's in this way that a system of hard rods will undergo an isotropic to nematic transition. It occurs through entropy maximization. The system gives up rotational degrees of freedom to gain translational degrees of freedom because there are more ways to arrange the particles if they line up. There's more excluded volume available per particle. So there are more ways to arrange a system, more entropy, and that's what stabilizes the state. The same is true, and this is a little less obvious, for hard spheres. And this was first predicted by Kirkwood in the 50s and shown in really the very first molecular dynamics simulation of particles that was done by Alder and Wainwright in the late 50s. And at the same time, one of the first Monte Carlo simulations of particles done by Wood and Jacobson. They both set out using computer simulation to test Kirkwood's prediction that even hard spheres, if crowded to a high enough concentration, might spontaneously crystallize just due to entropy. And in fact, it does at around 50% packing fraction of a completely thermodynamic equilibrium fluid of hard particles, hard colloidal spheres, will spontaneously form an FCC crystal because there are more microstates that are recognizable as crystal, ordered in a regular periodic arrangement, than there are ways for the particles to remain disordered. So it's an entropically driven phase transition towards ordering. And nowhere are entropy-driven phase transitions described more eloquently and more clearly than in this really classic paper by Don Frankel on entropy-driven phase transitions, published in 1999 in Physica A. This is a special picture of Don. He doesn't like to show it because the crown is tilted. He likes it when it's straight. But but Don he really is the king of entropy-driven phase transitions, and those of us like myself who work in this field learned everything we know from Don Frankel, who of course made his career here, and now is the chair of chemistry at Cambridge University. So we got started on this problem not because I started off being so obsessed with entropy like I am now, but we were trying to design CAD telluride, CAD selenide, and other type of semiconducting nanoparticles that a colleague of mine, Nick Kotov, makes in his lab across the hall from me. They're little nanometer-sized particles that happen to grow as little tetrahedra, and they're coated with ligands, and they have all sorts of interaction. There are van der Waals interactions between these particles in solution. The ligands can be hydrogen bonding with one another. The particles can be charged. They can have intrinsic dipole moments in them. And so we were trying to understand all these different kinds of structures that he was seeing. And at some point we said, well, what if we stripped away, because the simulators we can do this, what if we stripped away all of the interactions and left only the shape of the particle and asked, what would entropy do? And we were really surprised to find that entropy would do a lot. And in fact, entropy produced for us, just in the same way as hard spheres spontaneously crystallize, a crystal of hard tetrahedrally shaped particles that was actually a dodecagonal, 12-fold rotationally symmetric quasicrystal, which is a crystal that has no long-range translational order. There's no repeat unit like there is in a face-centered cubic crystal. You can't find a part of the crystal and then repeat it and get your crystal back. But instead, it has long-range rotational ordering to it, like in Penrose tiles. And this was and still is, to my knowledge, the single most complex structure known and produced, at least in a computer simulation, due solely to entropy, just coming from hard colloidal type particles. It's so complicated that you can see here the yellow, there's yellow motifs and blue motifs, and so 5 particles will come together in a pentagonal dipyramid, and then there's 12 particles that will come together in a 12-member ring where the tetrahedra go up, down, up, down, up, down, all the way around. And then they stack up, pentagonal dipyramid, 12-member ring, dipyramid, 12-member ring, and then those things form logs, and those logs stand up next to each other and tilt a little bit. And all of this spontaneously occurs out of the disordered fluid, just sitting there in thermodynamic equilibrium, and then just slowly compressing, until you get around 50% packing fraction, and then you wait for it, and this just comes out robustly every time. If you were to find the nearest periodic crystal approximant, it's called, it would have 82 particles in the unit cell. So I just found that amazing. This is what the bond order diagram along the top and along the bottom, the diffraction pattern looks like. On the sides, you see the diffraction pattern in the periodic direction. So dodecagonal quasicrystals are an example of an axial or planar quasicrystal. So it's quasicrystal in 2 dimensions when you look down the 12-fold axis, but it's periodic in the 3rd direction, and so that's what you see there. But if you look along the 12-fold axis, you see these beautiful high-resolution diffraction patterns from the simulations that look as nice as a crystallographer would ever want to get in an experiment. You could clearly see all these 12-fold rings going around, reflecting this long-range rotational symmetry. So quasicrystals were discovered back in the early 80s by Dan Sheckman and his colleagues at NIST, my former home, but that was way before my time, although I did work on the hallway where Dan Sheckman and John Kahn worked, so you could feel the excitement. And so Dan Sheckman won the Nobel Prize for discovering quasicrystals in the lab in 2000. He won the Nobel Prize in 2011 because it was not necessarily because quasicrystals were so technologically important yet, but because it represents an entire paradigm shift in the way that we think about crystals, to think that you could have structures that violated typical symmetry conditions and could have this kind of long-range quasi-periodicity. Now, our particular dodecagonal quasicrystal of tetrahedra is actually isostructural to another chalcogenide quasicrystal comprised of tantalum and tellurium. And we take the tantalum-tellurium diffraction pattern and superimpose it on our diffraction pattern, we see that it matches up peak for peak. So it's as though the centers of our little hard tetrahedra are sitting at the atomic positions of the tantalum and tellurium atoms in the chalcogenide quasicrystal. Now, there are other soft matter quasicrystals, but they make up a tiny fraction of all of the quasicrystals that are known. Since the discovery of quasicrystals in the 80s, there have been more than 10,000 publications on quasicrystals, but only about a couple dozen in the field of soft matter, and those only started in like 2003, 2004, with reports of soft matter quasicrystals formed from dendrimer molecules, which are, dendrimer molecules are branch molecules that have a starting point at the core, and they come out with branches, and then from each branch tip come more branches and more branches, like a little fractal object. You could make them, more and more and more generations, and you have this big kind of squishy thing with a hard, rigid core in the middle, and those things take the place, if you will, of atoms. They're like giant atoms. And although micelles, such as dendrimers or block copolymer micelles or surfactant micelles, are known to self-assemble into face-centered cubic or body-centered cubic, and even A15 and other type phases, it was never seen before that they could form quasicrystalline-like phases. And so these are just some examples where 12-fold and even 18-fold rotationally symmetric quasicrystals were found. But for the most part, they're all 12-fold symmetric. And what they all have in common is that they're all formed of these micelles. And when micelles form in block copolymers, in surfactant systems, even in systems of little nanoparticles with little polymer tethers on them, once those micelles form, they're sort of like closed objects. They self-assemble and they're sort of terminal objects. And those objects have a much weaker interaction with each other than the molecules within them making up the micelle do. So you could, and they're typically spherical, and you could almost think of the self-assembly of these micelles like the self-assembly of hard spheres or soft spheres, squishy spheres. And in fact, it's possible to understand the self-assembly of these as being analogous to what happens in metallic systems. So what is typically described in metals via pairwise interactions between metal atoms as being responsible for long-range quasicrystalline order is achieved here in micellar systems due solely to entropy. Okay, so how far can we go with entropy? Was this quasicrystal finding of hard tetrahedra just one example with many more to come? Is it just the tip of the iceberg, or did we just get lucky? Well, we definitely got lucky, but was that it? Was there not much more to be found? And so we embarked upon this study that we've been doing now for several years of every shape under the sun and trying to understand what is the role of shape and the entropy due to shape in organizing, in self-assembling systems, and in particular, for hard particle systems where you could actually imagine screening out the interactions, then you really want to know what entropy is going to do. But even in systems where you still have other kinds, van der Waals, electrostatic, and other interactions between your particles, knowing the role of entropy that's coming just from the shape alone is very important in the design of nanoparticle systems for particular targeted structures. There's a lot of groups in the community working on these kinds of problems, and one of the most prolific groups is right here in the Netherlands. Marjolein Dijkstra's group, of course, is one of the leading groups in the world in simulating entropically driven phase transitions as a function of shape, and comparing those with dense packings of shapes, and trying to understand how these kinds of phases are stabilized in all sorts of different shaped systems. Now, what we did is we started a system. We started with our tetrahedron. We said, well, how robust is it? What happens if the tetrahedra aren't perfect, right? When we synthesize them in the lab, the tetrahedra are really perfect. The tips might be high energy apices. They might get blunted, and they could be slightly polydispersed in size, et cetera, et cetera. So we said, let's do a study where we take our tetrahedron, we start snipping the corners. Now, if you snip a perfect tetrahedron enough, you get to a perfect octahedron. And so we said, all right, let's study all those shapes in between. And what I'm showing you here is the tetrahedron on your left, which is what gives us the quasicrystal. And you can actually snip it a lot and still get that quasicrystal to form very robustly. And then at some point, you snip it too much, and now, instead of the quasicrystal self-assembling out of the fluid phase, a diamond crystal self-assembles out of the fluid phase, where now the tetrahedral particles flip in a staggered way, every other one, in much the same way that you would see carbon atoms in diamond in a staggered ethane configuration. If we keep snipping even more, not quite to the octahedron, then we see this very complicated bipartite structure with 16 particles in the unit cell that's isostructural to a high-pressure lithium phase, where the centers of our particles would be like the lithium atoms under high pressure. And then if you snip even more, eventually you get to a BCC phase that's known for octahedra. And so in looking at that, we tried to understand, well, what is governing what structure forms as a function of the shape of the particle? And the thing that really screamed out to us was that the particles, we know that the particles are trying to maximize entropy to minimize free energy because there is nothing else. To maximize entropy means you want to maximize the amount of free volume in the system. And what we could see here is that the particles all want to maximize the alignment of the biggest faces of the particles, because by doing so, it's like Onsager on steroids. So instead of rods coming together and having to align to get more give up rotation for translation, these tetrahedra are coming together, or the truncated tetrahedra are coming together, and they're aligning on their faces to create more wiggle room, more free volume in the system. And that's what's governing what's going on. So then we got really eager, and we embarked upon a much bigger study. My student, Pablo Shotgun Damasceno, decided to take a shotgun approach at this, and he went to Mathematica, and he said, what's the first 145 shapes in Mathematica? So he studied all of the Platonic solids, all of the Archimedean solids and their duals, the Catalan solids. There are 92 Johnson solids, and then he picked a bunch of zonahedra, prisms, and antiprisms for good measure. And each one of those, we did a study like we did of the tetrahedron, and said, okay, as we increase the density, what do we get? Do we get a phase transition? If we do, what kind of structure do we see, et cetera? And just to give you an example, so out of those 145 particles, 101 of them self-assembled into a recognizable structure. These are just a few of them. We get things that are like your typical FCC, BCC, simple cubic structures. We also get, at the bottom, you see liquid crystal type structures where the particles align either in some overall pneumatic phase, they're kind of pointing in one direction, or some smectic layered phase, or even discotic type phases. But there's some of them, I want to highlight those, that I'll just blow them up here, from dodecahedra and truncated augmented dodecahedra and this barrel-like structure that form beta manganese structure with 20 particles in the unit cell, or gamma brass with 52 particles in the unit cell. I'm just amazed that these things figure out to form crystals with such large unit cells due solely to entropy. It's not something that I would have anticipated years ago before starting this project. And in particular, structures that typically you need multiple types of atoms, like gamma brass, to see. We even got a decagonal quasicrystal, but the decagonal quasicrystal was always metastable to face-centered cubic. So we'd have a liquid, out would come this beautiful structure in the lower right of a decagonal quasicrystal, and we watched that for a while, and it would just spontaneously crystallize to face-centered cubic because that's the lower free energy or higher entropy state of the system. Now, some of the crystal structures that we found have been validated, have been found by various groups. Chad Merkin's group has found a number of the simpler structures, or trying to get some of the more complicated structures, even without Chad's DNA programmable assembly, just throwing hard particles in solution. Also, Peidong Yang's group has reported this high-pressure lithium phase in octahedra, but using depletion interactions, which is another entropic force that we'll talk about in just a couple minutes. And so the search is on for some of these more complicated structures, and we're trying to see how complex can we go with this. Having all this data allowed us to start to see trends. And so we could group things together. So we grouped them together into all the liquid crystals and all of the proper crystals that we saw. And then in the upper right-hand corner, you see 66 different crystals that we call plastic crystals. These are rotator phases, meaning that the particles self-assemble into crystals where the centers of the particles are sitting very in an organized way on lattice sites of with some crystal symmetry, but the particles are free to rotate around. And that rotational entropy appears to stabilize these crystals. In other words, if you were to stop them from rotating, in some cases the crystals just fall apart. And so the rotational, that rotational degeneracy is critical in stabilizing these kinds of crystal structures. So one of the things that I found most surprising about all this is that when we took all of our crystals, so 101 of those formed crystals, but that means that 44 of them, they just did not form crystals no matter what we did. It doesn't mean that they can't, but just kinetically, they just didn't. But if we took all the ones that form crystals and we looked at, in the crystal phase, we said, okay, what's the coordination number of the lattice that you're in? That's like asking what's the valence of the particle. And then we plotted that, and then we said, okay, now if we go back into the fluid, where any diffraction pattern would show you nothing. Bond order diagram shows you nothing, no correlations. It's just a fluid. And you ask, what's the coordination number or valence there? We plotted it. We found a nearly 1-to-1 correlation between the valence, the effective valence in the fluid and the crystal, meaning that already in the fluid, there's a type of emergent valence due to shape that's already dictating what crystal is going to form. And so if we look further, we could see that there are different classes of shapes. There are shapes where they act a lot like metallic bonding systems. These are the ones that make the really complex, big, large unit cells like beta manganese. And all of those are rotator crystals. We see ones where they're like covalently bonded systems, and instead of having many facets, they have some really distinct large facets that control the coordination number. And then we see others that are like molecular liquid crystals and form these kind of molecular liquid crystal smectic, pneumatic, and columnar phases. And so what we learned from this is that shape entropy creates a valence that morphometrically mimics their atomic and molecular counterparts upon crowding. So how do we quantify this? The right way to think about what's going on here is that if you were to grab any nearest neighbor pair of particles in the system, they're all moving around by Brownian motion, but there's a sea of other particles around them, and that sea of other particles around them is imposing an osmotic pressure on those two particles. And there's a competition. These two particles, on their own, want to have as much wiggle room, as much free volume as they can. So if we look at like a pair of the truncated purple tetrahedra or the pair of the orange cubes, they want to have as much wiggle room as possible. On the other hand, the closer they get together, the more free volume there is for everybody else in the system. And those two competing terms can be quantified by writing down basically a potential of mean force and torque. This is a standard kind of construct that's used in colloidal systems, where typically you'd write it down, you have some bare interaction term, in which all your intrinsic interactions between the particles would be put. But here we don't have any. We're saying these are just hard particles. We've gotten rid of all the bare intrinsic interactions. We just have steric interactions. And then you have the competition between these other two terms that counts the number of ways that a pair of particles can be arranged relative to each other. And for each one of those, all the ways in which you can arrange all the other particles in the system. And the reason why by writing this down is useful is it gives us, for the first time, a tool to quantify just how strong is one of these entropic bonds in the system. So here's an example taken from this truncated tetrahedron system that's truncated still enough to form, not enough to form diamond, still wants to form a quasicrystal. But so it's one of these very dense fluid states. And in this dense fluid state, we just pick one pair that's next to each other. We say, what's the difference in free energy of the system between that pair being aligned along their faces or pointing like this? And that's what's shown here. The difference in free energy is 3 kT. That's big. That puts this emergent entropic interaction, and this is still in the fluid phase. This puts these entropic bonds, if you will, of the same importance numerically as hydrogen bonds or van der Waals interactions or even some screened electrostatic interactions in some of these systems. So even in the presence of other interactions, it's important to be able to quantify the role of entropy in contributing to order in your system rather than disorder in your system. Now, when we look at our systems, we're typically thinking in terms of we have a bunch of particles and they're in some solution which we just imagine is imparting Brownian motion to the particles, and we're just confining them more and more to make it denser, denser, denser. There's another entropic force that is closely related, which is typically thought of as a depletion interaction, and that's where you have colloidal particles in solution. And in addition, you have a third component, which is a much, much smaller particle or a little polymer molecule, something that maybe for a 1 micron sized colloidal particle might be 50 nanometers and something in diameter. And the more of these little depletant particles or depletant molecules you throw in, then the more likely you are to get an effective attraction between the big colloidal particles. And the way to think about it is in this way, every one of the big colloidal particles has an excluded volume region to it. And and that takes up some volume where other particles can't go. And then you think about all the microstates available to all the depletant molecules in the system. There's a gazillion of them. But if the colloidal particles come together, then all of a sudden it frees up a little bit of local free volume that is now available to these much, much tinier particles, giving you many more microstates for the particles, making it very entropically favorable. And so that is what's behind the depletion interaction, and it produces an effective osmotic pressure of the depletant molecules on the particles, on the big particles holding them together. So that's another example of entropy ordering things. The systems that we're talking about are related to that, except that we don't have depletants, but imagine that the little depletants are now the original the particles themselves. Of course, you have many, many fewer of them. So actual depletion interactions can be much, much stronger. But still, the ones that we're seeing are very, very strong and can produce ordering in these systems. And you can find out everything you ever wanted to know but were afraid to ask about colloids and the depletion interaction in this textbook, of course, from Henk Leckerkerker and Remco Tonnier. I'm sure I'm not saying that properly, which is a beautiful treatise on colloids and the depletion interaction. And so what we've tried to do is pull together what is known about entropic forces from depletion interactions, entropic forces from these purely hard particle systems, from what Onsager knew, from Asakura Osawa, and put it all within this one generalized framework that makes it possible to think of these things in a similar way, and allows us to connect a lot of the work from all of these wonderful Dutch physicists, some of which are here with us today, like René van Rooij, who I haven't mentioned yet, and Alfons van Bladeren, who have studied various examples of entropic forces in colloidal systems due to depletants and other types of problems. And so Fred mentioned that my group has worked a lot on patchy particles, and the idea behind that is trying to understand how can we design nanoparticles and colloids with interactions such that we could get them to self-assemble into structures that we have decided that we want a priori. What we can do now with shape is that we can now understand how, even in the absence of any sticky patches, explicit sticky patches, we can put shape into particles and get effective sticky patches that can help to get the kind of order that you might want in your system. So I want to close with just a couple of examples of how far we think we can go with entropy, just to show you some very recent things. So you might think, well, if you want a target crystal structure, why not take the crystal structure and find out what its Voronoi cell is, right? So you can take any crystal structure and find out what is the Voronoi cell of that. And some crystal structures will have multiple Voronoi cells. There's multiple Wyckoff positions to consider. And so then imagine that you know what the Voronoi cell is, so you know already by construction, in the limit of infinite pressure, they have to fit that together like a puzzle to give you this space-filling structure, and that's your lattice that you started with. So what if you could make particles in the shape of the Voronoi cells, then throw those in water, confine them, and see if they self-assemble? And what we find is that sometimes that works. What we find also is sometimes that doesn't work. And sometimes you get a totally different phase, and it seems to be related to the symmetry. Like the highest symmetry particles work and the lowest symmetry particles don't work. But one of the things that jumped out at me that I just was just amazed by was that in some of the systems where you have two types of Voronoi particles, and you know that they have to be ordered in the final structure, you take those two types of Voronoi particles, you throw them in a box, and out comes, like in this case, the target structure that you started with. But there's occupational degeneracy in the positions of the Voronoi particles. So in other words, somehow entropy maximization and the shapes of the particles are enough to give you the structure you started with, but without everybody in their right positions. So that's something interesting that we're still looking to figure out. We were really excited to see this recent paper from Alfons van Bladeren's group, where they figured out this really clever way to start with spherical particles and grow them in a crystal in such a way that they form the Voronoi, they adopt the Voronoi shape of the crystal structure that they started with, that they want to have. And so we think that this Voronoi particle shape approach might be something that's viable in the future. My friend and colleague Nick Kotoff at Michigan and I have done a lot of work where we study his little CAD telluride, CAD selenide particles. Sometimes we mix them together with proteins. And over the past couple of years, we've been studying a specific system of highly polydispersed nanoparticles that self-assemble, and they're charged, all like charged particles, also with van der Waals interactions. And instead of forming big crystals or large elongated structures, they come together and form micelles, many, many, many micelles. And each one of the micelles is basically exactly the same size, with several hundred nanoparticles in them. They adopt a core shell structure by size in the nanoparticles. And once they grow up to a certain size, they stop. And if you put another nanoparticle near it, doesn't want to touch. The force is completely balanced because of a charge renormalization that goes on during self-assembly due to the screening of the interactions by salt in the solution. And what's amazing is that the structure of those superparticles that form is so good that those big spheres now crystallize into an FCC cubic crystal, and that's what's shown in the TEM micrograph behind the cartoon images from the simulations, is this nice ordered crystal. So we can, and at that point, those big spheres are organizing by entropy, even though just like micelles from surfactant systems, originally was other interactions that pulled those spheres together into spheres. Just in this month's issue of Nature Materials, there's a beautiful series of papers. There's a especially beautiful paper by Alphonse von Blatter and Marlene Dijkstra, showing what happens if you take hard spheres, they're going to crystallize into FCC like we saw. But what they showed is that if you confine it so that you inhibit the spheres from adopting the FCC crystal and promote the natural tendency towards local polytetrahedral, local icosahedral ordering of the spheres, that you can actually grow an icosahedral crystal, a periodic crystal with icosahedral symmetry and faceting, out to about 1,000 particles, which is much bigger than anyone thought you could do before, and that's due solely to entropy. And I'm going to close with an example of something that we haven't gotten yet from entropy, but which we're hunting for. And I leave it as a challenge to the students and postdocs in the audience to think about how you might do this. I mentioned that so most of the known quasicrystals are icosahedral, full three-dimensional quasicrystals, so they're quasiperiodic in all three directions, yet all the soft matter ones so far are planar. So in the same issue of Nature Materials, we reported on the first computer simulation of an icosahedral quasicrystal, which we got not by shapes and entropy, but by point particles interacting with a short range, totally isotropic, pair potential, and one component. So that's already weird and crazy and unexpected, that you don't have to have multiple components, and you don't need long-range interactions, and that you don't need many-body terms, which might give you angular correlations, angular interactions. But so far that is a quasicrystal that is energetically stabilized and requires explicit intrinsic interaction. And so we're thinking about what kind of shapes you might be able to make that could self-assemble into structure of this incredible level of complexity, where in this structure, the nearest crystal periodic approximant, we can rule out already things with 5,000 to 10,000 particles in the unit cell, so something would have to be bigger than that. So I leave that as a puzzle to you, and I'll end there, and thank you very much for the opportunity and for sticking around so late in the day. Thank you.